Imagine your daughter's entire future, depending on how well she waltzes or chats at a party.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit like a Jane Austen novel, right?
Mm.
But that was the reality for young women during the London season for centuries.
Oh,
A
absolutely.
whirlwind of balls and events,
Mhm.
all to snag a husband.
All designed to find that perfect match.
Luckily, you're just joining us for a deep dive into this fascinating world. We're going to be using the History Tea Time podcast episode on debutantes in the London season to break it all down.
It's amazing how this system, which is so often romanticized, especially in period dramas, was actually pretty restrictive for these women. We're
Right.
talking generations shaped by this tradition.
So let's rewind. It's the Middle Ages in England.
Okay.
You're a young woman from an aristocratic family. What's life like?
Well, forget about choosing your own path. Marriage is basically your only option.
Wow.
And your father, he's the one calling the shots about choosing your husband.
So not exactly a love match situation. Why was that?
It's all about context, right?
Yeah.
Back then, women couldn't inherit property or have careers. Marriage wasn't just about romance, it was about economic survival.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. And I imagine the competition was pretty intense.
Oh, absolutely. There was a shortage of eligible men, especially with all the wars going on.
Yeah.
Parents were scrambling to marry off their daughters young, sometimes as young as 12 before they missed their chance.
12, that's unimaginable. Was marriage the only option for these young women?
For those who didn't find a husband, entering a convent was a real alternative.
Okay.
It offered a certain amount of freedom and security, even if it meant giving up worldly things.
So you've got these two paths, marriage or the convent.
Mm-hmm.
Then things get shaken up, right?
Yeah.
With King Edward IV in the late 1400s.
Yes, Edward visits the Burgundian court and is totally captivated by their system of courtly love and the graceful way the young men and women interacted. He brought this inspiration back to England
Right.
and set up a similar system in his own court.
So is this the start of what we might call a finishing school for noble girls, where potential suitors could see them?
Exactly. Mothers were now desperate to have their daughters become maids of honor. It was a ticket to social advancement and, of course, a good marriage.
And then Henry VIII comes along and just changes everything.
Right. His break from the Catholic Church and then all the convents closing.
Right.
It really limited the options young women had.
What a curveball. That must have made the pressure to find a husband even more intense.
Absolutely. And Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, she turned up the heat on the competition even more by expanding the number of maids of honor.
Okay, so the system is starting to take shape. What happens next? Queen Charlotte enters the picture.
Yes. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and Queen Charlotte needs to boost the monarchy's image.
Okay.
She starts holding these huge charity balls, inviting all the eligible noble ladies to be presented to her.
Is this where the debutante as we know it really comes from?
You got it. It's 1780, and Queen Charlotte's birthday ball becomes the official kickoff for the social season
Oh,
and a young woman's entrance into the marriage market.
I bet the excitement and the nerves were just through the roof.
Imagine these young women dressed up in those big hoop skirts and feathers,
Yeah.
curtsying to the queen. Then they have to walk backwards out of the room with everyone staring at them. One wrong move, and their reputation was toast.
It's just like something you'd see in Bridgerton, right?
Yeah, the parallels are uncanny. But we have to remember, this is real history with real consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. So this court presentation was just the start. Then comes the main event, the London season, right?
Exactly. From January to July, London was like a giant social hub for the aristocracy. Parliament was in session. Everyone was back from their country estates. The city was buzzing with events, and matchmaking was the name of the game.
And everyone was navigating this whole world of the ton with its strict etiquette and social hierarchy.
Oh, yeah. The ton dictated everything. Having the right manners, the right connections, and of course, wealth. One social slip-up could ruin you.
It sounds incredibly intense. What was the timeline like? How much time did these young women have to get a proposal?
The pressure was immense. They were expected to find a husband within their first 2 seasons. Otherwise, they risked becoming a spinster, which was a pretty terrible label back then.
Wow. So what was a typical day like for a debutante during the season?
Mornings. They were all about social calls. Imagine visiting friends and acquaintances, having tea, making polite conversation. Basically, it was networking. They even had this thing where they'd leave calling cards if someone wasn't home.
Oh, wow.
And that meant you had to return the visit.
It sounds like a full-time job. What about afternoons?
Afternoons were for promenading in the park. It was all about seeing and being seen, whether in St. James Park during the Regency era or later on, Hyde Park.
And of course, evenings were for those fancy balls and parties.
Exactly. And we're not talking just a few nights a week.
Right.
These debutantes were going to social events almost every single night. Some families even held their own private balls, which were super extravagant and allowed them to, control the guest list.
So you're mingling with all these potential husbands at these balls, but with so many restrictions, how much could they actually interact?
Not a lot. Chaperones were everywhere, conversations were limited, and any alone time was a big no-no.
That sounds incredibly frustrating. What about the dances?
Oh, dances were super regulated, ladies got dance cards, and gentlemen could sign up for a dance, but just one dance per gentleman was considered okay. Two, maybe that hinted at a romance, but three, scandalous, unless an engagement was on the horizon.
Hold on, so the women didn't even get to choose who they danced with?
No, it was up to the gentleman to make the first move.
Talk about a power imbalance. Were there other social events besides the balls?
They went to the theater, the opera, but it wasn't so much about the show itself.
Right.
It was more about being seen with the right crowd and showing off your status. Having a box at the opera, that was a big deal.
So it was all about strategic appearances and who you knew. What else did they do?
Oh, then there were the pleasure gardens,
Okay.
like Vauxhall and Ranelagh. Picture this. You're strolling through these gorgeous gardens, enjoying music, art installations. They even had hot air balloons.
Oh, wow.
These gardens were all about amusement and socializing.
Sounds magical. But what if a gentleman wanted to, you know, pursue a lady further? How would that even work with all these rules?
He could send flowers. That was a classic. He could also visit her at her family home, but only at certain times. And of course, a chaperone always had to be there.
So, no sneaking off for a romantic walk.
Absolutely not. A young woman's reputation was everything. Even the tiniest hint of impropriety could ruin her chances of getting married.
The stakes were incredibly high. It wasn't just about finding love, it was about securing your entire future.
Exactly. The London season and the whole debutante world were a high-stakes game with really strict rules.
We've talked about a lot. The historical context, the pressure on these women, the social scene, the rules of courtship.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's a lot more to uncover.
Stay with us, because when we come back, we'll be diving deeper into the mechanics of the marriage market, the money talk, the titles, and some fascinating stories of famous marriages and how they turned out. You won't want to miss it. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of debutantes and the London season.
It's interesting how much we tend to romanticize this era, but really beneath all the glitz and glamour, there's this really complicated reality.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about, a young woman's reputation was everything back then. But let's be real, marriage back then was about a lot more than just finding true love.
Right, it was like a business deal in a lot of ways.
Exactly. The marriage market was basically a high-stakes chess game, with families making all these calculated moves to get the absolute best match for their daughters. Before a gentleman could even think about proposing, he had to prove to the lady's father that he was financially stable.
So it wasn't just about winning her heart, it was about proving he could support her.
Absolutely. The potential groom would have to lay out all his financial details
Okay.
to show he could provide for a family. And the father, he'd reveal the size of the dowry. It was a straight-up negotiation.
Dowries themselves were such a fascinating part of this whole system.
Yeah, a dowry was like this lump sum of money that the bride's family would pay to the groom when they got married.
Right.
And the size of that dowry, it could make or break the whole deal. It was a way to sweeten the deal,
Right.
make sure the bride would be taken care of financially, even if the marriage didn't work out.
So it wasn't just about love, it was about economics.
Yeah.
And of course, titles played a huge role in this whole marriage market too.
Oh, absolutely. Getting a husband with a high social standing, that was the ultimate goal. Dukes, marquesses, earls, the whole aristocratic hierarchy was in play. Mothers were obsessed with getting their daughters married up the social ladder.
And for young men, especially the ones who didn't inherit a title, the pressure to prove themselves must have been enormous.
Totally. Younger sons, the ones who didn't get the family fortune, they had to choose a respectable profession, like a doctor, a lawyer, or a military officer. These were seen as honorable paths, but the real prize was getting a title.
It seems like everyone was constantly being judged.
That was the reality. It was a very competitive, very stratified society where marriage was your ticket to security and moving up in the world.
Speaking of competition, we can't forget about Olmec's assembly rooms. This was the place to see and be seen, right?
Almack's was the social hub during the London season, but getting in, that was a whole other story.
Oh, that.
It was controlled by this group of powerful patronesses.
Okay.
These were basically aristocratic wives with tons of social influence. They could make or break your reputation.
Sounds a bit intimidating.
Oh, they could be. They controlled the guest list, enforced a super strict dress code, and if you offended them, blacklisted. Even the Duke of Wellington got turned away once because he wore trousers instead of those knee breeches everyone had to wear.
Wow, no one was above the rules. So getting into Almack's was even more important than being presented at court.
For a lot of people, yes, it was like the ultimate symbol of social acceptance.
We've talked about the business side of marriage, how important titles were, and how exclusive places like Almack's were. But these were real people with real feelings, right? The source we're looking at mentions some pretty interesting examples of famous marriages and how they played out. What are some that come to mind for you?
Well, there's the story of Georgiana Spencer and the Duke of Devonshire.
Good.
She was known for being beautiful, a real fashion icon. He was the most eligible bachelor around. Seemed like a fairy tale, right?
You'd think so, but it wasn't exactly a happily ever after, was it?
Sadly, no. It was far from a fairy tale. The marriage was really unhappy. The Duke was more interested in gambling and other women than he was in Georgiana. She was stuck in this loveless marriage. It just shows that even in this world of arranged marriages, people still had feelings.
It's really sad, and it challenges the romanticized view we tend to have about this period.
Another example that shows just how complicated love and marriage were back then is the story of Lord Byron.
Ah, Lord Byron, the famous poet. What happened there?
Lord Byron actually called the London season a marriage mart,
Wow.
which says a lot about how he saw it. He ended up marrying Anne Isabella Milbank, but they were totally mismatched. She was very religious, and he had a reputation with the ladies. The marriage lasted just a year.
So even for someone as famous and wealthy as Byron, finding true love in this system wasn't really possible.
It really highlights the limits of a society where marriage was mostly about social and financial advantages. And often that came at the cost of real affection.
These stories make this whole historical period feel much more human. Behind all the fancy parties and traditions, these were real people dealing with societal pressure and trying to find happiness in a system that wasn't always set up for it.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how those same pressures exist in our own time.
That's a great point. One thing that struck me in the source material was the double standard when it came to, well, chastity and sexuality. It's almost hard to believe now.
It's important to acknowledge that, yeah.
Yeah.
Women had to be virgins before marriage, while men were often encouraged to have experiences beforehand. It was a total double standard that just reinforced how unequal things were between men and women.
It's shocking to think that some doctors actually believed that women didn't even have sexual desire, and that some mothers just gave their daughters a very basic explanation of sex right before their wedding night, or even told them to just do whatever their husbands wanted.
It's a stark reminder of how deep-rooted these ideas were about female sexuality and the role women played in marriage. It really shows how little control they had within this whole system.
Meanwhile, you have young men going to brothels and having sexual experiences before marriage. It's crazy.
This double standard had such a lasting impact on how society viewed women and their sexuality. It shows how far we've come, but also how much work we still have to do to achieve real equality.
Okay, so we've talked about the marriage market, dowries, titles, and even that really stark double standard around sexuality. We've also looked at some interesting historical examples that show how complicated love and marriage were during this time. But societies change, right?
Mhm.
What were some of the things that led to the decline of the debutante ball in the London season?
World War I was a major turning point.
Okay.
The war really shifted societal norms. Women started taking on new roles and responsibilities outside of the home, and all the devastation of the war really challenged that rigid class system that had been in place for so long. People from all different backgrounds had to come together.
So the war forced people to reevaluate what was important, and those old social structures started to fall apart.
Exactly. And after the war, there was this feeling of disillusionment and a desire for change. Those old traditions just didn't seem relevant anymore in a world that had gone through so much.
The source we're looking at mentions that wealthy American families started to have more influence during this time. What role did they play in all of this?
By the late 1800s, a lot of British aristocratic families were struggling financially, while American families were gaining wealth and influence.
Okay.
American heiresses, with their big dowries, became really sought-after brides. Some even used their wealth to basically buy their way into court presentations.
So there was this influx of new money And a clash between old traditions and new ways of doing things.
Yes, and it created this really interesting social dynamic. Some people welcomed the change, while others felt like traditional values were being lost.
We can't forget about Queen Elizabeth II's role in all of this. She's the one who officially ended court presentations, right?
That's right. In 1958, Queen Elizabeth II announced that debutante presentations at court were over. It was a symbolic gesture that marked the end of an era.
So a tradition that had lasted for centuries finally came to an end. But it's interesting that debutante balls haven't completely disappeared, have they?
They haven't. It's kind of fascinating to see how this tradition has stuck around, even though it's taken on different forms. In the United States, for example, debutante balls are still pretty common, especially in the South.
Yeah.
They've changed to focus more on things like academic achievements and community service, but some people still criticize them for promoting elitism and outdated social norms.
So the debate continues about whether these traditions are still relevant in today's world. It seems like we're still wrestling with the legacy of the debutante era in many ways.
Absolutely. It brings up all these important questions about social class, gender roles, and why we're so drawn to tradition.
This deep dive into the world of debutantes has been really eye-opening.
It has.
We've covered everything from its beginnings to its decline. We've looked at the social, economic, and even the emotional sides of this fascinating period. But what does it all mean for us today? How do these themes we've talked about connect to our modern world? It's amazing how something like the London season and debutante balls, which seem so old-fashioned, can still make us think about things like class, gender, and what society expects of us.
It really shows how history can help us understand what's happening today. Even though debutante presentations don't really exist anymore, those basic ideas of social pressure, competition, and wanting to be seen as important are still very much with us.
Yeah, when you think about the pressure young people face now, especially with social media, it's like a modern version of being seen at all the right places, except now it's all online.
That's a great point. Think about those Instagram feeds where everything looks perfect.
Oh, yeah.
The pressure to look a certain way, to get all those likes and followers, it's all about wanting to be accepted and seen as valuable, just like those debutantes trying to get noticed at Allmax.
And there's still that pressure to find the perfect partner, even though what we consider perfect has probably changed over time.
Definitely. The pressure to find someone who fits in with certain social and economic expectations hasn't gone away. It just looks different now.
It's like the marriage market has gone digital, with dating apps and algorithms and even articles about how to marry rich.
It's a really interesting evolution of those same societal forces. And just like back then, there's this constant pressure to meet certain standards of beauty, success, and social status.
It's definitely something to think about. This deep dive into the world of debutantes has been so eye-opening, not just about history, but about our own culture and how we still deal with these complicated social dynamics.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something in the past. It's woven into everything about our present, shaping our values, our expectations, and even how we act.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this episode, I can't help but wonder, if the London season was still a thing today, would we be tempted to play the game?
That's a great question. Would we get caught up in all the excitement, the glamour, the competition? Or would we resist the pressure to fit in and try to create our own path?
It's definitely something to consider. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of debutantes and London season. It's been a fascinating exploration of history, society, and the things that still resonate with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious and keep those questions coming.